the physicist who came in from the cold. Klaus Brenner stood at the entrance of the Los Alamos laboratory, his security badge still warm from the laminating machine. The New Mexico sun beat down mercilessly on the desert compound, but inside his chest, a different kind of heat burned, the heat of duplicity, of divided loyalties, of a secret that could reshape the world. Born in Berlin in 1911 to a family of committed socialists, Brenner had fled Nazi Germany in 1933, watching helplessly as the brown shirts burned books and persecuted anyone who dared to think differently. His brilliance in theoretical physics had earned him refuge first in Britain, then in the United States, where his expertise in fast neutron reactions made him invaluable to a project so secret that even its name was classified. But Klaus Brenner carried another identity, one known only to a handful of Soviet intelligence officers operating under deep cover in New York City. To them, he was Agent Prometheus, named after the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. As he walked through the sprawling complex of hastily constructed buildings, Brenner reflected on the path that had brought him here. His recruitment by Soviet intelligence hadn't been dramatic or coercive. It had been almost disappointingly mundane. A conversation at a Cambridge faculty party in 1938, a shared concern about fascism, a gradual deepening of trust with a man who turned out to be an NKVD officer. The Soviets hadn't needed to threaten or bribe him. Brenner genuinely believed that no single nation should monopolize the power he was helping to create. The bomb, and by now, everyone working on the project understood they were building a bomb, was too dangerous to remain in any one country's hands. The balance of power, he reasoned, would ensure it would never be used. Inside Building Y, the theoretical physics division, Brenner's colleagues barely looked up as he entered. They were too absorbed in their calculations, their blackboards covered with equations that described the behavior of uranium-235 and plutonium-239 under conditions of extreme compression. These men and women, some of the brightest minds of their generation, were solving puzzles that had never been solved before, creating a weapon that had never existed. Dr. Robert Harrington, the group leader, waved Brenner over to his desk. "Klaus, take a look at these cross-sections. Something's not adding up in the implosion calculations." For the next 3 hours, Brenner lost himself in the pure mathematics of nuclear physics, the elegant dance of particles and forces that govern the universe at its smallest scales. This was the work he loved, the reason he devoted his life to science. But always in the back of his mind was the other task, the careful mental cataloging of information, the memorization of numbers and procedures that would later be transcribed in invisible ink on innocuous-looking letters sent to accommodation addresses in New York. That evening, alone in his small apartment on Bathtub Row, Brenner began composing his next report. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, using a special chemical solution between the lines of an ordinary letter to his aunt in Manhattan. The information he was about to transmit would seem insane to anyone who hadn't been inside the project. Reports of a weapon that could level an entire city, of explosive forces measured in thousands of tons of TNT, of reactions so fast they occurred in millionths of a second. He knew that when Moscow received his reports, the initial reaction would be skepticism, perhaps even disbelief. The scale of what the Americans were attempting seemed to defy reason. But he also knew that the scientific details he provided, the precise specifications, the engineering challenges, the theoretical breakthroughs, would eventually convince even the most doubtful Soviet physicists that this was not fantasy, but terrifying reality. As he sealed the letter, Brenner wondered if he was doing the right thing. He believed in his cause, in the necessity of preventing American nuclear monopoly. But he also understood that he was betraying the trust of colleagues who had become friends of a nation that had given him sanctuary. The die, however, was cast. Agent Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods, and the world would never be the same. The dead drop in Santa Fe. The routine was always the same, yet every time felt like the first. Klaus Brenner would request a weekend pass, citing the need for supplies or simply the desire to escape the claustrophobic intensity of Los Alamos. The security officers, accustomed to the eccentricities of their physicist charges, rarely questioned these excursions. Santa Fe, with its adobe buildings and artistic pretensions, offered a stark contrast to the utilitarian sprawl of the laboratory. Tourists and locals mingled in the plaza, creating a perfect environment for tradecraft. The city was close enough to Los Alamos to make regular visits plausible, yet far enough removed to offer anonymity. Brenner's contact, a man he knew only as Victor, had established several dead drop locations throughout the city. The most frequently used was behind a loose brick in the wall of the Chapel of San Miguel, the oldest church in the United States. The historical irony appealed to Brenner's sense of the absurd, passing nuclear secrets in a place dedicated to peace and prayer. On this particular Saturday, in March 1944, Brenner carried information that he knew would electrify Moscow. The implosion method, the technique of using conventional explosives to compress a subcritical mass of plutonium into a supercritical state, had finally been proven theoretically viable. The calculations he'd helped complete over the past month demonstrated that with precise timing and symmetric compression, a chain reaction could be initiated with far less fissile material than the gun-type design required. He browsed the shops on the plaza, making small purchases, a book on Southwestern art, a turquoise pendant for a fictional niece, establishing his presence as just another weekend visitor. His trained eye, however, was constantly scanning for surveillance, for the telltale signs of tail. The FBI had counterintelligence officers scattered throughout the region, and the project's security director, a paranoid former Army officer named Colonel Drummond, suspected that the Soviets had penetrated the project. At precisely 2:17 p.m., Brenner entered the chapel. A few tourists murmured in the pews, admiring the retablos and the wooden vigas supporting the ceiling. He knelt in a pew near the back, made a perfunctory sign of the cross, and closed his eyes as if in prayer. His report, reduced to microfilm and sealed in a waterproof capsule no larger than a vitamin pill, rested in his palm. The chapel's cool darkness offered temporary relief from both the physical heat and the psychological pressure. For just a moment, Brenner allowed himself to feel the weight of what he was doing. These weren't just abstract equations he was passing along. They were the keys to unprecedented destruction. Yet he forced himself to remember why he'd begun this journey. The Nazi threat, the conviction that monopoly over such power would corrupt any nation, the belief that only mutual deterrence could prevent catastrophe. After 10 minutes of apparent devotion, Brenner rose and walked slowly along the wall, examining the colonial-era paintings and statues. When he reached the designated brick, he stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. In that fraction of a second, the capsule transferred from his hand to the cavity behind the loose brick. To any observer, it would have appeared as nothing more than an old man steadying himself. Outside, the spring air felt crisp and clean. Brenner walked to a nearby cafe and ordered coffee and biscochitos, the traditional New Mexican cookies. He read his newly purchased art book, occasionally glancing at his watch. The pickup would occur in approximately 3 hours, giving Victor or his courier time to retrieve the drop without risk of surveillance associating them with Brenner. What Brenner didn't know was that his report would cause chaos in Moscow. When the microfilm was developed and translated, the initial reaction from Soviet physicists was incredulous dismissal. The implosion technique seemed impossibly complex, requiring precision, timing measured in microseconds across dozens of explosive lenses. The amount of plutonium specified seemed far too small to achieve critical mass. The entire concept struck some as elaborate disinformation, designed to send Soviet researchers down a rabbit hole. But one physicist, a man named Yakov Terletsky, recognized the brilliance of the design. He had been working independently on similar theoretical problems and had reached comparable conclusions. Brenner's report provided the confirmation and technical details that transformed speculation into actionable intelligence. Within weeks, Stalin would be informed that the Americans were indeed building an atomic bomb, that the project was far advanced, and that the Soviet Union urgently needed to accelerate its own nuclear program. As Brenner finished his coffee and prepared to return to Los Alamos, he felt a curious mixture of relief and dread. The information was passed, his duty fulfilled for another month. But each report brought him closer to the day when this double life would end, whether through discovery and prosecution or through the successful detonation of the weapon. He was helping both to create and to counter. The nuclear age was coming, and Klaus Brenner was one of its reluctant midwives. Moscow's disbelief. 5,000 miles away, in a nondescript building near Lubyanka Square, Pavel Sudoplatov crushed his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray and read the decoded message for the third time. As head of the NKVD's Department S, responsible for intelligence operations against the United States and Britain, Sudoplatov had seen countless reports from agents in the field. Most were mundane: troop movements, political gossip, industrial output figures. But this report from Prometheus was different. "He's either a genius or completely mad," muttered Anatoly Yatskov, the New York resident who had personally supervised the courier chain that brought the microfilm to Moscow. Perhaps both. The report described a weapon of such devastating power that it seemed to belong to science fiction rather than science fact. According to Prometheus, the Americans were close to completing a bomb that would release energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT from a device small enough to fit in an aircraft bomb bay. The mechanism involved splitting uranium or plutonium atoms in a runaway chain reaction, with each fission releasing neutrons that would trigger additional fissions, all occurring in less than a millionth of a second. Sudoplatov had immediately convened a meeting with Soviet physicists to evaluate the report. The session had devolved into heated argument. Half the scientists dismissed the report as either fantasy or deliberate misinformation. The other half, including the brilliant but prickly Igor Kurchatov, insisted that the physics was sound and the threat real. "The numbers are too specific to be fabricated," Kurchatov had argued, pointing to the equations Prometheus had provided. "Look at these cross-sections, these neutron multiplication factors. Either your agent has access to experimental data from an active nuclear program, or he's the most creative liar in history." But even Kurchatov expressed doubt about the implosion design. "It's theoretically elegant," he admitted, "but the engineering challenges are enormous. You would need to compress the plutonium core with perfect symmetry. Any asymmetry would cause the material to squirt out before reaching critical mass. The precision required is unprecedented." Sudoplatov chain-lit another cigarette. The decision before him was consequential. If Prometheus's reports were accurate, the Soviet Union faced an existential threat. An America armed with atomic bombs and willing to use them could dictate terms to the entire world. But if the reports were disinformation, diverting resources to a crash nuclear program would be a costly mistake, resources that could otherwise support the war effort against Germany. "What do we know about Prometheus himself?" asked Georgy Flerov, a young physicist who had been advocating for a Soviet nuclear program since 1942. Yatskov opened a slim file. German-born physicist, fled the Nazis in 1933. Excellent credentials, studied under Max Born in Göttingen, published significant papers on neutron physics. Recruited by us in 1938 in Cambridge. Ideologically motivated. Believes fascism is the primary threat and that no single nation should monopolize advanced weapons. He's proven reliable in previous reporting, though nothing of this magnitude. Could he be a double agent? Flerov asked. Working for the Americans to mislead us? Possible, but unlikely, Yatskov replied. We vetted him extensively. His information on British scientific developments during 1938 to 1940 was consistently accurate and valuable. And consider this. If the Americans wanted to deceive us about their nuclear capabilities, wouldn't they exaggerate rather than provide such detailed technical information? Sudoplatov stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Moscow streets covered in late winter snow. The fate of nations might hinge on his recommendation to Stalin. The dictator was already paranoid about being deceived, seeing conspiracies everywhere. If Pseudoplato vouched for Prometheus and the reports proved false, he might end up in the cellars of this very building. But what if the reports were true? Comrade Kurchatov, Pseudoplatov said finally, turning from the window. If we assume Prometheus is telling the truth, how long would it take the Americans to complete their bomb? Kurchatov considered carefully. Based on the progress described in these reports, I would estimate 12 to 18 months. Perhaps sooner if they've solved the plutonium purification problems. And how long would it take us to build our own? The physicist's face grew grim. Starting from where we are now, 5 years minimum, possibly 10. We would need to construct reactors, develop separation facilities, train personnel. The Americans have a several-year head start and vastly greater resources. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implications. By the time the Soviet Union developed its own atomic bomb, the Americans might have dozens, perhaps hundreds. The balance of power would be irrevocably tilted. There's another consideration, Yatskov added quietly. Prometheus reports that some scientists at Los Alamos are already discussing the possibility of a super bomb, a fusion weapon that would make their current fission bomb look like a firecracker. If such a weapon is possible, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Pseudoplatov made his decision. We proceed on the assumption that Prometheus is accurate. Comrade Kurchatov, you will prepare a comprehensive report for Comrade Stalin, outlining what we know and what resources would be required for a Soviet nuclear program. I will recommend that Prometheus be given whatever support he needs, additional contacts, better communication methods, more frequent extractions if necessary. He paused, crushing out his cigarette. Gentlemen, whether we believe it or not, we must act as if the world is about to change forever. Because if Prometheus is right, it already has. The Handler's Dilemma. Harry Gold hated New Mexico. The physicist hated the dust, the heat, the interminable train ride from his cover job in Philadelphia. But most of all, he hated the risk. Every trip to Santa Fe, every dead drop serviced, every clandestine meeting increased the probability of detection. And detection meant execution. The Rosenbergs' fate had made that abundantly clear, even though their case was still years in the future. Gold's role as Prometheus's handler was complex and dangerous. Born to Russian Jewish immigrants, Gold had been recruited into Soviet intelligence during the Depression, motivated by a mixture of ideology and the simple need for money. His chemistry background made him a natural choice for handling scientific intelligence, though his shy demeanor and chronic anxiety seemed ill-suited to espionage. On this trip, in June 1944, Gold had a special assignment. Moscow wanted more than just Prometheus's technical reports. They wanted to understand the scope of the entire Manhattan Project, its budget, its personnel, its timelines. They wanted to know about the other scientists, the security procedures, the locations of production facilities. In short, they wanted everything. Gold checked into a modest hotel on the outskirts of Santa Fe, using one of his several false identities. In his briefcase, hidden in a false bottom, was a list of questions from Soviet physicists, technical queries so specific that only someone with deep access to the project could answer them. Some questions seemed almost comically detailed. What is the precise isotopic composition of the reactor-produced plutonium? What neutron reflector materials are being tested? What is the maximum temperature achieved during implosion? The meeting with Prometheus was scheduled for the following evening at a location they'd used only once before, a hiking trail in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, far from curious eyes. The wilderness meeting reduced the risk of surveillance, but increased the danger if something went wrong. Out there, help would be hours away. Gold spent the intervening day in careful counter-surveillance. He walked aimlessly through Santa Fe, doubling back frequently, ducking into shops, and exiting through back doors, taking a taxi in one direction and walking back. By evening, he was reasonably confident he was clean, but reasonable confidence in espionage was never enough. The FBI's counterintelligence division, though stretched thin by wartime demands, was competent and persistent. As twilight approached, Gold drove a rented car toward the designated trailhead. The mountains loomed purple and imposing in the fading light. their peaks still crowned with spring snow. He parked and began hiking, following the trail markers that Prometheus had meticulously described in his last report. After 30 minutes of climbing, Gold spotted a figure sitting on a rocky outcrop, apparently resting and enjoying the view. As Gold approached, Klaus Brenner turned, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, two men from vastly different worlds, united by a cause that might save or damn them both. "Beautiful evening," Brenner said in English, the prearranged greeting. "I prefer the coast," Gold replied, completing the recognition sequence. They sat together, two hikers taking a break. While Gold trained, I swept the surrounding terrain for any sign of surveillance. Satisfied they were alone, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Moscow is very pleased with your work," Gold said quietly. "The information you've provided has been invaluable. Comrade Kurchatov personally asked me to convey his admiration for your courage." Brenner's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, pride, perhaps, or relief that his sacrifices were being recognized. "I have more," he said, patting a thick envelope inside his own jacket. "The implosion tests have been successful. They're now confident the plutonium bomb will work. And there's something else. They've begun discussing targets." Gold felt his stomach tighten. Targets meant the weapon was no longer theoretical. What targets? Japanese cities. They've compiled a list of potential sites with military and industrial significance. Hiroshima is mentioned frequently. Kyoto was initially considered, but may be removed for cultural reasons. Brenner's voice was flat, clinical, but Gold could hear the underlying horror. "When?" Gold asked. "The weapon should be ready for testing by July, possibly August. If the test is successful, combat use could follow within weeks." Gold handed over the envelope from Moscow. "These are questions from our scientists. Some are quite technical. Can you answer them?" Brenner scanned the list, and Gold watched as the physicist's face cycled through several expressions: recognition, calculation, concern. "Most of these, yes, but some touch on areas where I don't have direct access. I'll need to be careful about what I ask. Drummond's security division has been more aggressive lately. They've been conducting random interviews, checking on friendships, monitoring mail. Has anyone approached you?" "Not directly, but there was an incident last week. Someone asked why I'd requested a weekend pass to Santa Fe 3 times in 2 months. I said I had a lady friend here, which seemed to satisfy them." Brenner smiled grimly. "The irony is that it would probably raise fewer suspicions if I actually had a lady friend." They spent the next hour going through Moscow's questions, with Brenner providing what answers he could and making notes about information he would need to obtain. The sun had set completely by the time they finished, leaving them in darkness broken only by starlight, so brilliant it seemed artificial. "I sometimes wonder," Brenner said as they prepared to part, "whether we're preventing a catastrophe or enabling one. If both sides have these weapons, will that keep them from being used? Or will it simply guarantee mutual annihilation?" Gold had no answer. He was a courier, not a philosopher. But the question haunted him during the long drive back to Santa Fe and the longer train ride back east. In the physics of nuclear fission, the outcomes could be calculated with precision. In the physics of human nature, uncertainty reigned. Trinity, the desert had been transformed into a theater of apocalypse. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 16th, 1945, scientists, military officers, and select observers gathered at various distances from Ground Zero, a location in the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of Death, an apt name for what was about to occur. Klaus Brenner stood at the south shelter, 10,000 yards from the steel tower that held the gadget, as they'd nicknamed the plutonium implosion device. Around him, colleagues made nervous jokes, checked their dark welding goggles, and tried to hide their anxiety behind scientific detachment. Some had placed bets on the yield. Estimates ranged from 0, a complete dud, to Edward Teller's wild speculation that the bomb might ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life on Earth. Brenner knew, as few others did, that this moment would determine more than whether the bomb worked. Hidden in his pocket was a small camera, specially designed by Soviet technicians and smuggled to him through the courier network. If the test succeeded, he was to photograph the explosion and whatever aftermath he could safely document. Moscow wanted visual confirmation of what their physicists still struggled to fully believe. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, had positioned himself at base camp, closer to the tower than the other observation points. His thin frame was silhouetted against the temporary lights, and Brenner could see him chain-smoking, a nervous energy radiating from the man despite the studied calm of his voice on the intercom. At 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m., the countdown reached 0. For an instant, time seemed suspended. Then the desert became brighter than 1,000 suns. The fireball, impossibly bright even through the protective goggles, expanded with terrible grace, reaching temperatures comparable to the core of the sun. Brenner felt the heat on his exposed skin despite the distance, a physical manifestation of forces that humans had previously only observed in nature, never created. The mushroom cloud rose, climbing toward the straddle into the atmosphere, a pillar of fire and smoke that would become the defining image of the nuclear age. The shock wave arrived seconds later, a physical blow that shook the observation shelter and rattled equipment. Windows 40 miles away would later be found shattered. Around Brenner, men cheered, slapped each other on backs, or stood in stunned silence. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, reportedly turned to Oppenheimer and said, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer himself would later recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Brenner felt none of the elation. Instead, a cold certainty settled in his chest. The weapon worked. It worked better than their most optimistic predictions. The yield would later be estimated at around 22 kilotons, nearly twice what some had expected. And that meant everything had changed. In the chaos following the test, as scientists rushed to take measurements and examine the crater, Brenner found his opportunity. Using the confusion as cover, he took several photographs with his concealed camera. The mushroom cloud, still visible in the dawn light, the celebrating scientists, the observation equipment. He knew the images were poor quality, but they would serve as confirmation that Prometheus's insane reports had been accurate. The crater itself was extraordinary, a bowl of fused sand transformed by the heat into a green, glassy substance the scientists would call trinitite. The steel tower had simply vanished, vaporized. The implications were clear. A city exposed to this force would cease to exist. In the hours after Trinity, Brenner managed to compile a detailed technical report in his mind. The yield, the height of burst, the shock wave characteristics, the radiation patterns, all the data Moscow's physicists would need to refine their own designs. He knew this information had to reach Soviet intelligence immediately. The Americans would not wait long before using the bomb in combat. 3 days later, using an emergency protocol, Brenner passed his report and the film to Harry Gold at a prearranged dead drop in Albuquerque. The courier system worked flawlessly, and within 2 weeks, the information was on Stalin's desk. The Soviet dictator's reaction was immediate and furious. While publicly still allies with the United States, Stalin recognized that Trinity marked the end of that alliance's usefulness and the beginning of a new struggle. He summoned Lavrentiy Beria, the brutal head of the NKVD, and gave him a single order: build the bomb. You have whatever resources you need. Anyone who fails will answer with their life. Beria, in turn, summoned Kurchatov and a team of Soviet physicists. Prometheus's reports, culminating in the Trinity data, were laid before them. "This is no longer theoretical," Beria said coldly. "The Americans have the bomb. You will give us one, and you will do it faster than the Americans did. Is that understood?" Soviet scientists, who had been skeptically reviewing Prometheus's reports for over a year, now attacked the problem with desperate urgency. The detailed technical intelligence provided by Prometheus gave them a substantial head start. They knew what worked, what didn't, and where to focus their efforts. What had seemed impossible was now merely difficult. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, Brenner watched as preparations began for combat use of the weapon. The target list had been finalized: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. The bombs were being prepared modified versions of both the gun-type uranium bomb and the implosion plutonium design. On August 6th, when news arrived that Hiroshima had been destroyed, Brenner felt physically ill. The estimates of casualties, tens of thousands dead in an instant, many more to die from radiation, confirmed his worst fears. He had helped build this weapon, believing it necessary to defeat fascism. But he had also helped ensure that no nation would ever again hold monopoly on it. In the moral calculus of espionage, Brenner believed he had chosen the lesser evil. A world where multiple nations possessed nuclear weapons would be terrifying, but a world where only one nation held them would be more dangerous still. Balance, however precarious, was better than tyranny. The nuclear age had dawned at Trinity. The nuclear arms race would follow inevitably, fueled in part by the intelligence that Agent Prometheus had risked everything to provide. The Kremlin's gambit. The smoking ruins of Berlin still smoldered when Soviet scientists gathered in a hastily converted Moscow warehouse that would become the heart of the USSR's nuclear program. Stalin's orders had been clear and brutal: produce an atomic bomb or face the consequences. The word consequences needed no elaboration in Stalin's Soviet Union. Igor Kurchatov, now appointed scientific director of the Soviet atomic project with a budget that seemed unlimited, studied the reports from Prometheus with new appreciation. What had once seemed insane, the yields, the design specifications, the engineering requirements, had been proven terrifyingly real at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The photographs that filled American newspapers showed cities erased from existence, human beings reduced to shadows on pavement. "We were fools to doubt him," Kurchatov muttered, reviewing Prometheus's implosion design specifications for the 100th time. Every detail was accurate. The cross-sections, the neutron multiplication factors, even the difficulties with plutonium metallurgy. He gave us a roadmap. Yuli Karetin, Kurchatov's deputy, nodded grimly. The question is whether we follow that roadmap exactly or use it as a foundation for our own design. It was a crucial decision, one that reflected the peculiar nature of nuclear espionage. Prometheus had provided the Soviets with extraordinary intelligence, detailed technical specifications, engineering solutions, even failed approaches that should be avoided. But simply copying the American design seemed risky. What if Prometheus had been discovered and was now feeding disinformation? What if the Americans had deliberately included flaws in sensitive documents, anticipating Soviet penetration? The debate raged for weeks. Some scientists argued for creating an exact copy of the American design. Why reinvent the wheel when you had perfect blueprints? Others insisted on independent verification of every specification, modifying the design based on Soviet engineering capabilities and available resources. Beria, overseeing the program with his characteristic paranoia and brutality, sided with caution. "We build two bombs," he decided. "One follows the American design exactly. The other incorporates our own innovations. Whichever works best in testing becomes our primary weapon." The scale of the Soviet effort was staggering. Entire cities were constructed in secret to house the nuclear program. Artemis, 16, Chelyabinsk, 40, Krasnoyarsk, 26. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them prisoners from the Gulag, were mobilized to build reactors, separation facilities, and testing infrastructure. Scientists who had survived Stalin's purges of the 1930s found themselves working 18-hour days under constant NKVD surveillance. Meanwhile, in Los Alamos, Klaus Brenner had entered the most dangerous phase of his double life. With the war ended and the bomb used, security restrictions had paradoxically tightened. The FBI, now freed from wartime priorities, had dramatically expanded its counterintelligence operations. Colonel Drummond's Security Division began conducting extensive background checks on all Manhattan Project personnel, particularly foreign-born scientists. Brenner knew the net was closing. Several of his colleagues had been questioned about their political associations. Klaus Fuchs, another Soviet agent whom Brenner didn't know was also spying, would be arrested in 1950, confirming that British intelligence had penetrated the network. The courier system had been compromised. Harry Gold, increasingly erratic and stressed, was making mistakes that would eventually lead to his capture. In December 1945, Brenner made a difficult decision. He requested transfer to the University of California, Berkeley, citing a desire to return to pure research and teaching. His request was granted, partly because the Los Alamos facility was being reorganized and downsized, partly because Brenner's work on the implosion mechanism was largely complete. The transfer likely saved him from exposure. Freed from the intense security environment of Los Alamos, Brenner could more easily meet with Soviet handlers and pass information about America's post-war nuclear plans. And there was much to report: discussions of new bomb designs, debates about civilian versus military control of atomic energy, and alarming talk of preventive war against the Soviet Union before it could develop its own bombs. This last piece of intelligence proved crucial to Soviet planning. Some American military officers and politicians, recognizing the window of atomic monopoly, advocated using nuclear weapons to force Soviet compliance with American demands. The most extreme proposals suggested destroying Soviet industrial capacity and military installations before the USSR could develop its own nuclear weapons. "They're discussing attacking us," Stalin raged when briefed on Prometheus's reports. "While we smile and talk of peace, they plot our destruction." Whether Stalin genuinely believed the threat of American attack or simply used it to justify his own aggressive policies remains debated by historians. But the intelligence from Prometheus gave him leverage within the Kremlin, allowing him to mobilize resources and political support for the nuclear program. By 1947, the Soviet nuclear project was consuming a significant portion of the USSR's GDP. Reactors were operating, uranium was being enriched, and plutonium was being produced. Soviet physicists, working from Prometheus's reports but increasingly developing their own innovations, had solved the key technical challenges. The Soviet bomb would not be a simple copy of the American design. It would be a hybrid, incorporating American solutions where they were optimal and Soviet innovations where they offered improvements. Kurchatov reported to Stalin that a test could be conducted by late 1949, possibly sooner. The Soviet dictator, who had feared falling 5 to 10 years behind the Americans, was pleased but skeptical. "Make it work," he ordered Kurchatov. "If you fail, Beria will find someone who succeeds." Across the Atlantic, Klaus Brenner continued his academic work at Berkeley, maintaining his cover as a respected physicist while passing intelligence on American nuclear developments. He knew that discovery was inevitable. The FBI was too competent, the courier networks too exposed, the number of people involved too large. But if he could help ensure successful Soviet nuclear testing before exposure, he would have achieved his goal: preventing American nuclear monopoly. The race was on, though most Americans didn't know it. They believed their atomic monopoly would last a decade or more, that the technically backward Soviets could never match American scientific and industrial prowess. Prometheus's insane reports, delivered years earlier and initially dismissed as fantasy, had set in motion events that would prove them catastrophically wrong. First lightning. August 29, 1949. The Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, a desolate steppe chosen for its remoteness and its expendable population, prepared for a moment that would reshape the global order. Soviet scientists, technicians, and military officers gathered at various observation points, their emotions a mixture of pride, terror, and relief that the years of brutal effort might finally vindicate them. The device, designated RDS-1, an acronym with multiple interpretations, most commonly understood as Russia does it herself, sat atop a tower at the center of the test range. Its design bore unmistakable similarity to the American plutonium bomb, a legacy of Prometheus's intelligence, but incorporated Soviet innovations in the explosive lenses and neutron initiator. Igor Kurchatov stood at the command post, his famous beard unkempt after days without proper rest. Around him, physicists monitored instruments that would measure the explosion's yield, temperature, radiation signatures, and shockwave characteristics. Everything had to work. Failure would mean not just professional disgrace, but potentially imprisonment or execution. 30 seconds, announced the test director. Kurchatov thought about the path that had led to this moment. Prometheus's reports, initially dismissed as fantasy, had proven to be a gift beyond measure. Without that intelligence, the Soviet program would have been years further behind, stumbling through the same dead ends and false starts that the Americans had navigated. The mysterious spy had given the Soviet Union not just technical knowledge, but time, the most precious commodity in nuclear development. 10 seconds. At 7 a.m. local time, the device detonated. The explosion, estimated at 22 kilotons, remarkably close to the Trinity test yield, sent a massive fireball and mushroom cloud towering into the morning sky. The shockwave rolled across the steppe, rattling instruments and observation bunkers. Soviet officers, many of them veterans of the Great Patriotic War, stood transfixed by the display of power. This weapon, they understood, made the Red Army's massive tank formations and artillery batteries almost obsolete. Kurchatov felt tears streaming down his face, though whether from relief, pride, or horror at what he'd helped create, he couldn't say. It worked, he whispered. God forgive us, but it worked. The news reached Moscow within hours. Stalin, bedridden with what would prove to be terminal illness, received the report with grim satisfaction. Good, he said simply. Now the Americans will have to negotiate with us as equals. In Washington, the detection of the Soviet test came as a profound shock. American intelligence had predicted the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb until 1952 at the earliest, possibly as late as 1955. The discovery that the USSR had exploded a nuclear device 4 years ahead of schedule prompted urgent meetings at the highest levels of government. President Truman announced the Soviet test to the world on September 23rd, deliberately downplaying its significance while internally ordering a crash program to develop thermonuclear weapons. Hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than the fission bombs that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The FBI, already investigating Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project, intensified its efforts. Klaus Fuchs would be arrested in Britain in February 1950, and his confession would lead to the unraveling of the entire spy network. Harry Gold, David Greenglass, and ultimately Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But Agent Prometheus remained undetected. Klaus Brenner, teaching at Berkeley and publishing papers on nuclear physics, had ceased active espionage after the Soviet test. His mission was complete. The nuclear monopoly was broken, and the balance of terror that he believed would prevent nuclear war was established. Or so he thought. What Brenner couldn't have anticipated was that the Soviet success would not create stability, but rather trigger an accelerating arms race. The American response to the Soviet test was not acceptance of nuclear parity, but determination to restore superiority through more advanced weapons. Soviet success, in turn, would spur even greater efforts to match and exceed American capabilities. By November 1952, the United States would detonate the first thermonuclear device, Ivy Mike, with a yield of 10.4 megatons, roughly 500 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The Soviets would respond with their own hydrogen bomb test in 1953. Britain would join the nuclear club in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964. The arms race that Prometheus's intelligence had sparked would eventually see both superpowers accumulating tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy human civilization many times over. The balance that Brenner had sought to create would morph into something more terrifying: mutually assured destruction, a doctrine that promised any nuclear war would end in the annihilation of both sides. In the immediate aftermath of the Soviet test, however, Brenner felt a complex mixture of vindication and dread. He had succeeded in his mission to prevent American nuclear monopoly. But in doing so, he had helped unleash forces that might ultimately destroy humanity. The insane reports that Moscow had initially doubted had proven accurate in every detail. The nuclear race they sparked was just beginning, and its ultimate destination remained terrifyingly unclear. The price of secrets. The hammer fell on June 19, 1953, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison. the first American civilians executed for espionage during peacetime. Their deaths, controversial then and debated still, sent shockwaves through the network of scientists and intellectuals who had passed atomic secrets to the Soviets. Klaus Brenner, following the trial from Berkeley, understood that the net was tightening. Klaus Fuchs had been arrested in 1950 and sentenced to 14 years in British prison. Harry Gold had received 30 years. The Rosenberg's execution represented an escalation, a signal that atomic espionage would be punished with maximum severity. In a rented cottage in the Berkeley Hills, Brenner burned his final set of coded notes, watching the papers curl and blacken in the fireplace. Years of careful work, of double life and divided loyalty, reduced to ash. He wondered if it had been worth it, not in abstract strategic terms, but in human cost. The world he'd helped create was not the balanced, stable order he'd envisioned. Instead of deterring war, nuclear weapons seemed to make conflict more likely by providing a constant backdrop of existential threat. The arms race he'd helped initiate showed no signs of slowing. Both superpowers were developing increasingly destructive weapons, deploying them in greater numbers, and creating elaborate plans for their use. The FBI never knocked on Brenner's door. His careful tradecraft, combined with the courier network's compartmentalization, had protected his identity even as other members of the ring fell. Fuchs, under interrogation, had known only his Soviet handlers, not other agents. Gold had known Greenglass, but not Brenner. The network security had held barely. In the Soviet Union, the scientist who had built the first Soviet bomb using Prometheus's intelligence became heroes of socialist labor, awarded medals and privileges. Kurchatov, Karetin, and others received dachas, cars, and the grudging respect of a system that typically viewed intellectuals with suspicion. The atomic bomb had made them valuable, even indispensable, but they also bore the burden of what they created. Andrei Sakharov, who had developed the Soviet hydrogen bomb, later became a dissident and peace activist, haunted by his role in creating weapons of mass destruction. Kurchatov himself, in his final years, advocated for nuclear disarmament, though few listened. The true identity of Agent Prometheus was never definitively established by Western intelligence. Soviet records, when they were finally opened in the 1990s after the collapse of the USSR, confirmed that a highly placed source within the Manhattan Project had provided crucial intelligence on the implosion design, but they used code names and compartmentalized information in ways that made identification difficult. Klaus Brenner died in 1987, having lived to see the arms race reach its terrifying zenith. More than 60,000 nuclear weapons deployed globally, weapons that could have destroyed human civilization dozens of times over. In his final years, he gave interviews about the Manhattan Project, carefully omitting any mention of his espionage. To his colleagues and students, he remained a respected physicist who had contributed to the wartime effort and then returned to academic research. Only in his private papers, discovered after his death and still classified in some jurisdictions, did hints of his double life emerge. Cryptic references to difficult choices, mentions of people and places that didn't fit his official biography, and a coded journal that suggested contact with Soviet intelligence. The debate about Agent Prometheus's role in history remains contentious. Did his espionage prevent American nuclear monopoly from leading to atomic blackmail, or even preventive war against the Soviet Union? Or did he simply accelerate the arms race, bringing humanity closer to annihilation? Would the Soviets have eventually developed nuclear weapons without his intelligence, making his betrayal pointless? These questions have no definitive answers. What is certain is that the intelligence Prometheus provided was extraordinary in its scope and accuracy. His reports, initially dismissed as insane by skeptical Soviet physicists, proved to be remarkably precise. The implosion design he described, the yields he predicted, the engineering challenges he outlined, all were confirmed by subsequent development and testing. His espionage shortened the Soviet nuclear program by an estimated 2 to 5 years, years that could have been crucial in the immediate post-war period. Whether this acceleration prevented catastrophe or brought it closer remains one of history's great what-ifs. In the end, Agent Prometheus exemplifies the moral ambiguities of the nuclear age. Was he a traitor who betrayed his adopted country and endangered its security? Or was he a visionary who recognized that nuclear monopoly was more dangerous than nuclear parity? Was his espionage a crime or a service to humanity? Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that he was both and neither, a man caught between competing loyalties, making choices that seemed necessary in the moment, but whose long-term consequences could never be fully predicted. His insane reports exposed the Manhattan Project to Soviet intelligence and sparked the nuclear race that has defined global politics for 3 generations. The mushroom clouds that rose over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and later over test sites in Nevada, Kazakhstan, the Pacific, and elsewhere cast long shadows that extend to our own time. Agent Prometheus helped shape the world we inherited, a world that has thus far avoided nuclear war but lives under its constant threat. His story reminds us that in the age of weapons that can destroy civilization, there are no simple heroes or villains, only human beings making impossible choices with consequences they could never fully foresee. The nuclear age that began with the Manhattan Project and was exposed by one spy's insane reports continues still, its final chapter yet unwritten.